All right, so welcome to this second StoragePoint webinar that I will be taking. So the first 15 minutes I'll be doing the slides and some labs as well we'll be doing. And then for the next 15 minutes we'll have the questions. So you can type in the questions and I'll try to get the answer as soon as I can. So today we'll be covering just one part, which is the granular recovery. Disaster recovery can be at many stages, and especially with StoragePoint. In the picture, there is a lot at stake, and especially because you have the unstructured blobs, namely the files that have been externalized. So so we'll just be covering part of it, and then as we move, we will cover the full recovery of the farm because we have our own tool, which is the Selector Restore Manager, namely. So first of all, I would like to give a background of the managing the SharePoint and StoragePoint. So we have seen that SharePoint has grown in organizations over the last few years, and it has grown to some, like earlier it used to be gigabytes, now terabytes, and maybe and like bigger organizations have got petabytes or something of data. So it has moved from being a department collaboration tool to a mission critical information repository. So with StoragePoint added, some people do think that it may appear to increase the complexity of a backup and restore, but that is not the case. That is not the case. Just give me a moment. I think I didn't put myself. All right. So it does look as if there is some complexity, but in reality, it gives us more options for doing a backup, the out-of-the-box one, especially since your unstructured data that has been offloaded or externalized can be used. So the out-of-the-box backup tools, right, can be used to back it up, your file share. The other thing that has been easier would be the SQL Server backup and log shipping is going to be performing faster because your database size has reduced of the content database size, because all your blobs, the unstructured data, has been offloaded and been sent to your file share. And of course, you can use the same file backups. Now, I have seen people use other third-party like semantic and tools to back up your whole environment. So for the file share, it is acceptable, and of course the SQL backups as well, right? You can use, but the only problem is the blobs that are externalized. If you're using third-party, it does not know, or it's not aware of the blobs that have been externalized. So moving on, before we move on to the disaster recovery, just wanted to give you some concepts in StoragePoint. So one is the Blob Immutability. So this is just to understand that once the blob is written, it does not change, right? So if there's any, like if you edit it, there's a new blob that will be written out, and it'll be left for StoragePoint. So you can either keep it depending on your retention period, or you can delete it. So this simplifies the backup of the file share because it's not dynamic. Like once it's externalized, that file will remain as it is. And if you have like versioning enabled, it will add the versions. Basically, the restore is also simplified because there's no need to find the most recent version of that blob in the backup, since any copy of it will be found any time, right? It's basically once you take a backup of your file share, you will be able to get the backup. So then, of course, the other concept is the blob references. So with StoragePoint, your file or the blob is externalized. So the StoragePoint externalizes in the sense it will write a reference, a blob reference in the content database so when you access your file or blob, it'll go look into the blob reference and see if it is externalized, and then of course it'll go to the StoragePoint database, which has the details of the endpoint and where like the UNC path is. So the blob reference contains three important pieces of information: a reference to the endpoint, which is the blob store location where the blobs reside, a unique identifier that is the GUID basically for the externalized blob, and the relative portion, the relative location of the blob within the blob store. So which is the UNC path you can have. So the important thing to remember about blob reference is not an absolute path. So it is not stored as an absolute path because it is all added up and then gets the information, right? So so basically StoragePoint takes this relative path and combines it with the configured endpoint path on the endpoint. That's why when you go to the StoragePoint details, you'll see it like first the folder path, the endpoint. So those are concatenated with each other. This allows content databases to be restored into different environments or locations in which the blob store endpoint may be different. So you can basically just take the blobs and the content databases and it onto another environment, and of course the StoragePoint database, and you can still reference those data. That's the reason why there's no absolute path. So the other concept is Orphan Blobs. So Orphan Blobs is a boon to keep, as well as it can add up your add up space, right? If you have a lot of content getting stored up in your file share. So so Orphan Blobs are basically blobs that are no longer referenced by SharePoint. So basically first you have the SharePoint files are existing. Once you delete it from SharePoint, it'll go to the first recycle bin, then the second recycle bin, and of course then it will, once you delete it completely from SharePoint, then it is considered as Orphan Blobs in terms of StoragePoint. And there is an Orphan Blob cleanup. Now it is called Unused Blob Cleanup to make sure these blobs are eventually removed from the file share endpoint. Thus, you're freeing up the space. But keeping these Orphan Blobs allows you sometimes, saves a lot of time and does granular backups. So that's what we're going to touch today, which is easier for you. So it's not always good to kind of go, okay, now once it goes away from SharePoint, delete it completely, right? So I have a question. I'll take the questions later. So how Metalogic's blobs is going to be recognized by other tools if required? Well, we don't have, so we don't have any tools that get recognized. We have our own tools. Now, if you want it to be recognized, you'll have to basically set up a new environment with all the components, namely your content database, your backups, and your blob share. So then, of course, comes the blob retention, right? So blob retention is a setting in the profile, right, StoragePoint profile, that tells StoragePoint how long to keep a blob file around after SharePoint is done with it. So that means it's completely gone from the SharePoint site as well as the two recycle bins. So for example, take this scenario, when you keep backup tapes of corporate systems on site and off to a maximum of 180 days, this is the furthest you can go back to do a restore of any kind. You could set, so you can basically set your Orphan Blob retention policy in StoragePoint to map that tape retention period to 180 days. By default, it is 30 days for the retention period. So preventing StoragePoint from removing Orphan Blobs from the blob store for 180 days from their initial detection. All you would have to do is restore the SharePoint content database entry for the content item, and you're looking that you're looking for, and it would automatically find its blob. So you just have to restore just from the content database, and if you already have that blob, it will automatically pick that up. This restore would be much faster because it's not restoring any actual files, just the metadata in the content database and the blob reference. If the content database backup is older than the blob retention period, then the blob store endpoint must be restored as well. So yeah, if you don't have that on your endpoint, then you need to restore that as well. That's where the complexity of StoragePoint comes into the picture. So so now we move on to the main point of granular level restores. So the first thing is to use asynchronous profiles for ease of finding the files on the endpoint. So say suppose you have a user who's deleted content. If you have deleted a file and you want to go and search, right? You can have, if you, with the asynchronous profiles, you do get the option of having the exact structure. So it'll tell, okay, the site name, then the document library level, and then the file name, and then there'll be a GUID, right? So you can basically go, if you have asynchronous profile, it is easier for you to find on the endpoint and then do the restore or give it to the user, and they can delete it from SharePoint, the bad file or reference, and then re-upload it after renaming it, of course. So now this, we are all assuming that we are doing it for 2010, because with 2013 the chunking comes into the picture, and then this granular backup or level restores are basically not coming in the picture unless you have created the chunk size of 20 MB and the file is like less than 20 MB, because then there'll be only one blob, right? So now there are tools that we have also given to there's namely the blob reference to so say suppose you want to know that what are my missing files, right, or what files are missing in my environment, right, in my each of my profiles. This tool helps you see. It does a lot of other things, but this also tells you that if there is a blob missing, right, on the endpoint, then it'll give you the whole path, and I'll show you. It'll give you the path, and of course you can just copy and paste it to the exact location if you have a backup from your backup, and of course you can, that will help you in finding in the whole environment any issues with your files or blobs missing. So that the other point is to use a large retention period for the orphan blobs. So I know if you have a lot of data, right, if it depends on you. So by default is 30 days. Now you could increase it or decrease it to say you don't want that much. If you already have a backup utility and everything that takes care of your file share, and you do not want the orphan blobs in the endpoint to add up to your space, then of course you can reduce the retention. But again, then you have to always fall back if you want to do granular restores to your backups, right? Or you could just have a bigger retention period so that the orphan blobs are also in the endpoint, and in case of a disaster, not disaster, or you want to do a granular level restore, you can just search for the file. It's as simple as that, and you'll be able to locate that if you have asynchronous profiles. And of course, because otherwise it'll be like in a GUID format, which is very difficult to get to it. So if you have like in the GUID format, then you'd have to use our other selective restore manager. And of course, then there is the use of backup endpoints, because what backup endpoints does is it will keep a copy of your endpoints, like whatever versions, everything, in another endpoint, which you can basically use to restore. So if you have the GUID, you can just go into that backup endpoint and get that GUID and restore it to the endpoint. Or we have, of course, selective restore manager to do that. So, okay, so using the list, so you can do the restore by using a list of the missing files. There's like 2 files that are created. It'll give you the one file with the underscore error will give you the blobs and everything that are missing, and can see if the backup endpoints have the files in the GUID and basically restore it. Restore the file users. If it's still within the retention period, you can just restore that. Now, I remember I mentioned that 2013 has chunking, and hence doing granular restores manual will not work unless the file is in one chunk. Okay, so that covers the part of theoretical part. Now I'll take you to the StoragePoint tool. This is the blob reference that I did, and you can basically see that this is the display error blobs, and you can view. So whenever you do a blob scan, let me open this file up. So it will create 2 files, which would be 13506 and 13506. So one would just give all the missing blobs or anything that's this would be the more comprehensive logs, and the error log, if there is some data like 4 kilobyte, that means there is some data missing if it's non-0 kilobyte. So if it's 0 kilobytes, it means you don't have any missing blobs. If you have this, then 4 kilobytes, then you can either just open it and try going through it, or easier way would be to open this blob file using the, okay, let me start it up again. I think I'm running out of time right now. Run as administrator. So yeah, the other thing I wanted to point out that so if you have asynchronous, right, it does help you because it will tell you the. So I'll go to the storage profiles, and so one of my profiles, I'm usually using asynchronous. So if you see asynchronous mode, if you click on the endpoint. Let me get this out of the way. Okay, so you see it uses, you have these options, right? If use SharePoint folder in Blob Store, use SharePoint file name in the Blob Store. So this option it gives you, which will allow you to basically go to the file and just do the restore. And of course, there's a limit and other things. If you have synchronous, it will not give you these options. It just give the file size. I don't know if I have. Let's make this synchronous and then add. So see, if you have synchronous, so what happens with the difference between asynchronous and synchronous is that with synchronous profiles, it will go directly to the endpoint. There's no system cache involved in between, and it'll just go directly to the when you upload content and you have a profile which is used for externalization. So in this, see, notice this, that's only the filter that you get is the file size, nothing else other than the file name and everything. So that's what the difference is. So if you have asynchronous and you just add the endpoint, you get these options, which does help you do granular restores. So, and depending on the retention, so here is a retention period that you need to put, so you can make it or increase it or decrease it. And so yeah, so let's go with the blob reference scan. And so here it'll basically, when you start it up, it will give you all the profiles. So you don't need to, if you already run it, you don't need to, you want to just see the error, the blobs missing, you just need to click on that middle part and you can browse to it. And where is that? So here's the 4 kilobyte, the error. So this will give you a better way to read it. So it'll give you the URL where that file is and the missing path, right? So this is the path that you're going to be interested in the file path, where if you go to, so this is Anupam copy, right? So if you go here just, it's on this machine itself. So okay, so it's not, so it's probably on the system cache. It's one of the profiles actually. So you can basically just go to that path, and so you see there's a logs v1. Let me see if okay, the other way. Let me open the other file up. So SharePoint 84. Okay, don't. It should actually give you the endpoint. If for me it's not giving, this endpoint is blank. That's why I'm not able to find the location. So if it's giving the endpoint, then okay, it's a BLNK file, right? So it'll be the system cache. No, not the system cache. Let me search for it. So, okay, I'll answer the question. So another question, if we have synchronous, can we change it to asynchronous? You could do that. It's just that you have to go and do the changes. Now, anytime, you'd have to also see if there's anything left in your system cache which you need to move it to the actual endpoint. So that you need to take care for the synchronous, right? So you could do that. Okay, so okay, so now the first question is how Metalogic Blobs is going to be recognized by other tools if required, or do we have to move everything back to the content database to opt another tool? Well, you don't need to move everything back. So if their third party is going to be recognized by other tools, this one is more of a third party, so that will not recognize it. So you would need to set up a whole environment. Offloaded. You would need to set up a whole new environment. Okay, so you would need to set up the whole environment. What and which situation can we can keep the orphan? So it depends on your use. So the question is, what and which situation we can keep orphan blobs. It depends on totally up to individual how you want to basically keep, like how you've got your disaster recoveries set up and everything else. So I don't know why that is. Well, I'll show you. Okay, so I do have some. So here, this is so I have Anupam test as that, and I have the blobs, right? So I have asynchronous profiles. If it's not asynchronous, then what it will do is it'll save it in this format. So it'll have the year, then its date is March, and 12th is the date. Sorry, a month is March, and 12th is the date, and then of course the time at 12:02 the blob came up. So you'll have in this format, which is very difficult to kind of see, okay, how do I see the GUID? Because it'll be in the GUID format like this. So that's the reason why asynchronous profiles will help you kind of just do a search and restore it, restore that file. So that's about it for in terms of the granular restores. So you just have to copy and paste it at that location. So the time created, the version it'll give you. Yeah, so it does say that it is the missing BLNK target file, right? Which means this blob is missing. And it gives the site ID and the doc ID. So you could, if you don't have the backup and you want to delete it, you could just use this delete selected files from SharePoint. All right, so that actually leaves me with very less time for questions. I've already answered some, so then I have one more. If you can provide one example. Well, in terms of, I've seen orphan blobs, if you want to clean it up, you can reduce the, if for some reason you got a lot of blobs and you're running out of space, then you need to, you can remove the orphan blobs, right, by just putting the retention period. If you can put the retention period to 1 day and then run the unused blob cleanup for like today and then again after 1 day, then it'll remove all the orphan blobs. So that's when you want to remove the orphan blobs, but usually you should have a good buffer which kind of so that you can restore content, because users delete files a lot of times, right? So so is it easier, so the question is by Vamshi, is it easier to migrate profiles from synchronous profile to asynchronous profile? Well, actually there is a table that has that kind of, which gives you the, I don't know if I have that. If you see the user guide, right, there is the what all filter options are available. And it's just a matter of, because if you do, there's an endpoint 2 modes, right? Endpoint selection mode. So if you have it asynchronous, you could basically move, okay, so if it's asynchronous, you do not have the option of moving it to synchronous or asynchronous. But if you have it to synchronous, then you could put it as the right mode into asynchronous or synchronous. I'll have to cover that. I can have another quick take for difference between synchronous and asynchronous profiles as well. Maybe that will, or the user guide. I don't have it offhand. Let's see if this opens up. The other question you had is, normally it's sometimes asynchronous is always not the choice. So with good GUID restores, how to restore? So that you can use Selective Restore Manager. Which we will be covering later, right? That's one of my topics later. So because this is just a granular restore, right? Another question, if you have asynchronous, can we change? Yeah, we already covered this. Is this usage of the blob reference scan for discovery and restoring of files documented anywhere? Well, it's a tool that we usually give when we suspect that you have any missing blobs. So say suppose your jobs are not running, like you get errors, that's where we suspect. And maybe if you have like complete and it's erroring out, then we suspect that sometimes, yeah, you could have blobs missing, and that's when we give the tool. It's a external one, and we have an internal one as well in the general settings. General settings here, and you can run, where is it? Oh, sorry, no, it's jobs, sorry. So under storage profiles and jobs, there is a built-in blob reference, right? You can schedule these ones as well, which will give you a log of if there are any missing blobs as well. So no, we don't have any. Okay, let me answer this one. Is the usage of blob reference for discovery? It's built in one. And we give if we suspect any missing blobs. And any license for that? No, we don't need any license. Of course, you need to have a good, you need to have a StoragePoint license, right? An environment. Only then it will work. Because if you run this tool anywhere else which doesn't have SharePoint installed, it will not basically it'll give you an error. So, but you need to. Okay, so that, do you have any other questions? I think that's I've come to an end for my presentation. So do you have any other questions, or the next time we will be covering Selective Restore Manager and the full disaster recovery, where if you see that's something which we provide, this Selective Restore Manager, which basically allows you to back up your content and restore it. So I hope this has been useful. I guess I'm already out of time. Sorry, I had to rush between questions and my presentation because it overshot itself. So thanks for attending, and see you next time in Disaster Recovery Part 2. So thanks.